Hi, I'm Dave Hilowitz. This video is about legato. Specifically, how to script for true legato in SFZ format. So let's start at the top. What is legato? Legato is, of course, the transitions between notes. If you think of an instrument like the violin or the trombone, instruments that generally only play one note at a time, when you transition from one note to another, it's a very specific sound, and a very specific sound that is not necessarily captured by conventional sampling. In a conventional sample library, you capture every note or almost every note. And when you set your sample library up, you do some mapping so that when somebody plays like a C3, it plays the wave file that corresponds to that note, C3. Then if somebody stops playing the C3 and they start playing a D, the sample engine stops playing that C3 file and it starts playing the D file instead. And that setup where you're stopping one note and then starting another note is great for modeling a ton of different real-world instruments like pianos and drums, instruments where there's no real noticeable transition between notes. But for other instruments, that can be very unnatural. Bowed stringed instruments, for example, have very pronounced slides between notes sometimes. You actually need to play another sample in between those two samples. And that other sample that you need to play is a recording of the transition between those two notes. So that's what true legato is. So if you think about it, this can get massively complicated very, very fast. Let's say you had an instrument that could play 36 different notes. If you wanted to include transitions from every note to every other note, you would need 36 times 35 notes. So instead of recording 36 samples, you're now recording 1,260 samples. Yeah, horrible. And it's not just the scripting that's complicated, it's actually just chopping up that many samples. And then imagine that you have different velocity layers or round robins. The combinatorics could just get totally brutal. And it's why a lot of people who are sampling these instruments, they just don't bother with legato because it increases the amount of work just exponentially. Of course, most people don't actually sample all the possible transitions from every note to every note. Sometimes you'll see just one octave's worth of transitions, so C to C sharp, C to D, C to E, but it'll only go up to one octave, and then they'll do that for every note. Still, it multiplies all of the samples you have by 12. So if you have 36 samples, well, now you need 432. So still a ton of work. Okay, having said all that, let's get started on our instrument. So I'm not going to record a full instrument right now because I don't have time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to record like 5 transitions on the viola, and then we can set it up in the sampler and just see how the scripting works. So I'm going to go through all of the sample chopping pretty quickly. I've done a bunch of other videos about how to chop up samples. If you do want to see a slower walkthrough of how I edit samples, check out my How I Make Sample Libraries video, linked below. As you can see, I do my actual sampling work in Reaper. I use Reaper because it's got fantastic scripting and it's very flexible, but you can use pretty much any audio editing software. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of anything I know is garbage. Then I'm going to chop up my samples and identify them. Right now, I'm chopping by hand because I only have a small number of samples. If I had a larger number, I would make use of Reaper's fantastic dynamic split tool, which can do a lot of this work for you. Okay, so we've identified everything. We've got a sustain, then a transition, sustain, transition, etc., etc. This, of course, is a very small sample set, but it should be enough to show you how to do the mapping. Now I'm going to take all of these legato samples and I'm going to put them on their own track. So the sustains will be on one track and the legatos will be on another. Then I'm going to name each track according to which type of note I've put on the track. Doing this helps me name the wave files that I'm outputting, because I can actually include the track name as part of the wave file name. That way I can get wave files that include sustain or legato as part of their names. Next, I'm going to figure out what notes we're dealing with. This is another example of something that I would normally not be doing by hand. In my How I Make Sample Libraries video, I show off some very cool scripts that detect and fix wave file pitches automatically. Still, for 8 samples, I think we can do it by hand the old-fashioned way. In order to do this, I'm going to put a tuner plugin on the track. I love mTuner by Melda. It's free, and it actually gives the MIDI note name of the note, so that's very helpful. And now I'm just going to go through all of my sustain notes, and I'm going to fix their pitches as needed. And I'm going to make each one loop using the same technique that I used in my How I Make Sample Libraries video. As I move along, I'm also going to create regions and label them according to pitch. This will make it easy to export in an organized fashion. Next, I'm going to go through all of my transitions. The only real requirement about this is that the transitions should fall in exactly the same spot in each of my exported files. Doing this hugely speeds up the work when you're putting together your libraries. I'm just going to use these grid lines from Reaper. My transition will happen exactly 2 grid lines after the start of the file. And I can figure out exactly how many samples that corresponds to later on. Legato transitions for violin and viola are super easy to identify if you look at the waveform. It will either get quieter or louder right at the point, but either way, you'll see some change in the waveform happening right where the notes switch. If you haven't done this before, you'll learn to recognize them visually pretty quickly, I think. In order to get these to line up, all I do is grab the wave file right where the transition is, hold down the Option key, and drag until the transition point is lined up with the grid line. Once I'm done with this, I'm also going to create regions for these, of course, and label them. You'll notice that each of these region names has 2 notes in it. There's the note we're transitioning from, and there's a note we're transitioning to. Next, I'm going to configure the region render matrix. This is this cool grid-based thing that tells Reaper which regions I want to export and which track it should grab the audio from. I want to export the legato regions from the legato track and the sustain regions from the sustain track. Remember how I made a big deal about separating out the legato samples onto their own track? This is where we're rewarded for having done that. In the render dialog, I'm going to configure my file names so that they include both the region name and the track name. We can actually click on the Files button, and it will show us what the names of the files it's about to export are going to be. There's a good way of double-checking to make sure you have the right settings. The only other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we're also outputting loop markers. I've labeled all my loop regions so that they start with a hash sign, and we can tell Reaper to only export regions that start with a hash sign. I think we're finally ready to export. Okay, let's make a sample library out of these. I'm going to launch Ableton Live because it's what's most convenient for me to work in. I'm going to pull up Sforzando because that's the SFZ plugin I usually use. I'm also going to launch my text editor, in this case Sublime Text. And I'm going to create a new file called violalegato.sfz. I'm also going to open my browser and point it to sfzformat.com. SFZ Format is a fantastic website that documents most, if not all, aspects of the SFZ format. It's written in large part by D. Smolkin, who is a veteran sample library developer. He releases libraries under the name Caro Riffer. I actually don't know exactly how you pronounce that, but yeah, strange and kind of like exotic instruments. A lot of really cool percussive things, double basses that have been played in unusual ways. I use his stuff all the time, so yeah, definitely check it out. Anyway, back to the SFZ format site. He's written a great little tutorial on how to implement legato, so we're going to be relying heavily on that. His article starts with a very basic scenario, and we're going to do the same. But before I do even that, I'm going to create regions, just as he has done here, for my sustain samples. I'm going to hop back into the Finder, and I'm going to grab these file names just by doing Control-C or Command-C, and I'm going to paste them right into my file here. And I'm going to make regions just in the same way, the sort of standard SFZ way. And because I am using fantastic Sublime text, I can edit many lines at once, which is extremely convenient. And I can even copy and paste things. So I'm going to grab the token from the file name that contains the pitch that we're dealing with, and I'm going to copy it over to the pitch key center. I'm going to set the low key to the same value, and the high key to the same value. So right now I've got a super, super basic SFZ instrument. So I'm going to set one thing that's completely global to all of my groups, and that is I'm going to turn off velocity sensitivity. I don't have multiple velocity layers, and right now I want it to just ignore the velocity. So I'm going to do amp vel track equals 0. All of these things are, of course, documented on sfcformat.com. It occurs to me that path is for decent sampler. This is actually going to be sample. I'm going to drag this in. Okay, seems to be working. I'm actually going to just fill in some gaps here and just generally reorient this. G and A actually come after F, because this is not alphabetical, it's actually musical. And maybe we'll have the low key go down to C, and we'll just fill in some gaps. There's E flat, which is D sharp in SFZ world. Okay, so we've got a full little range, super, super basic. Right now we don't have any kind of voice muting in place, so we can play chords and there's no attempt at legato whatsoever. The first thing we want to do is we want to make this instrument monophonic. I don't mean monophonic in the mono stereo sense, I mean monophonic in that only one sound or only one voice should play at a given time. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign a voice group. Now, this should not be confused with SFZ's group header, which is really a completely different thing. This is like a group that is only used for determining which groups can be playing exclusively. So we're going to go here, and here we're going to say group equals 1. And you can specify pretty much any number. It's just a completely arbitrary number that you come up with. So on its own, this isn't doing anything. We're just labeling these samples that are under this group as belonging to this group. The group opcode actually needs to be used in conjunction with another opcode called off-by. It tells the engine to stop playing the current sample if another sample containing the specified group number gets triggered. In other words, you get to specify which other group silences the first group. In this case, we're going to use the same group number, 1, which means that the group is self-muting. Every time the engine triggers one of these samples, it silences any other samples that might be playing within that same group. So now I'm going to play the notes again. It's impossible to play chords now because we have a monophonic sample library. So that's cool. That's exactly what we wanted, but we have yet to make use of any of those legato transitions. So it's time to add a second group, and I'm going to add those in the same way that I added the sustained samples earlier. I'm going to grab the file names, and I'm going to do a little Sublime text magic so that I can edit multiple lines at once. Since these are legato samples, they actually have 2 pitches in their file names, the pitch we're coming from and the pitch we're going to. We're going to use that 2 pitch, the one we end on, and that's going to be our pitch key center. Unlike with the samples above, I'm going to set the low key and the high key to the same value that I used for the pitch key center. Of course, if we play this in Sforzando now, it's going to sound terrible because we haven't set up our legato voice muting at all. We need to do several things now. First, we're going to assign a new group to the voice group. Let's call it 2. Next, we need to specify that the first group gets silenced by the second group. We're going to change its off-by value to group 2. That's the number of the new group. We're also going to make use of the trigger opcode. The trigger opcode has a bunch of different values, 2 of which are very, very useful for this kind of sample. There's first, which means that the sample should only trigger if it's the first note in a legato sequence. Then there's legato, which means the sample should only trigger if it's not the first note. These fit our scenarios pretty much exactly, so we're just going to use those for groups 1 and 2 respectively. So now I'm going to go back into Ableton and I'm going to play a D and then an E. Let's hear that again. So there's our legato transition. But there are a couple things wrong with it. First, it comes quite late after I hit the other key. You remember that when we did our sample editing, we made sure that all of our legato transitions occurred at the same point in their respective files, exactly 2 grid marks in Reaper after the start of the file. All we have to do to fix this issue is figure out what that offset is and add it to all of our legato regions. Ordinarily, this process involves some trial and error, but for the purposes of this example, I happen to know that a value of 43,000 works really well. Also, since we're going to be starting this WAV file halfway through, there's a chance that we're going to get a click at the start of the file, so I'm also going to add some attack. Okay, let's hear that in Ableton. It still sounds pretty weird, and part of the reason it sounds so weird is it's transitioning from this sustain sample to this legato sample immediately. It's basically just cutting this one off the second we hit the second key. We actually want it to do that a little bit more slowly, so we're going to add another opcode called off mode. Off mode allows us to control how voices get stopped. There are 2 options. There's the default option, which we already heard. It's called fast, and basically that stops the voice immediately. The second option is normal, and normal actually causes the release phase of the envelope to play out. In other words, it's as though you stop the note by letting up a key. We can then specify a release phase length by adding the ampeg release opcode. I'm going to make it 1 second just so we can hear it clearly. Okay, now let's hear our sample again. Okay, that sounds way better, but I've just noticed something else. If I play 3 notes in a row, it doesn't actually silence the second note at all. That's because we haven't actually specified an off-by setting for that second group. So we're going to make this group self-muting. I'm also going to grab the same off mode and release time here that I used above. So we should have the same smooth transitions. Sounds way better. But there's several problems still, so let's continue working through them. So right now I've just been demoing this by going from D to E. I have a transition for that, and from E to F, I have a transition from that. But if I try to do a transition that I don't actually have in my file, it's still going to trigger those transitions. Watch this. Here's DE. Sounds good. And let's hit that E, but coming down from the F. Ooh, right? It's still triggering the DE transition even when I'm coming down from F. So we want to specify that the engine should only play our DE transition when we're actually coming from a D. Luckily, there's an opcode for that, SW previous. You'll remember that when we did our mapping for these legato transitions, we used the 2 pitch for our pitch key center opcode. We never told the engine anything about the pitch we were coming from. The SW previous opcode is where we get to that. Check it out. Okay, let's hear how that works for us. First, I'm going to play DE. Sounds great. And now I'm going to play FE, and we just want to make sure that that transition doesn't actually trigger. So it didn't trigger, right? But it also just kept playing the F. And the reason for that is because we didn't find any samples that were valid to play in group 2, we just never stopped the sample that was playing in group 1. So here I am holding down an E, and the engine is actually not playing an E. What we need to do is we need to specify a fallback sample. Specifically, what we want is these sustain samples up here to play if there's no transition down here. This is where things can get quite dicey. Different SFZ implementations work in different ways. For the time being, I'm going to say that the only true, safe way to do this is to specify all of your potential transitions the longhand way. Basically, for every key that you could be coming from, for every key you could be going to, make sure that you have a corresponding line in your legato group. That sounds really onerous, I know, and it is. Yeah. I'm going to copy over all of our regular sustain samples into group 2, and then we're going to work our way through them. Our first sample is D3, We have no transitions to that. So we want that to play anytime D3 is the second note in a legato run. Our second sample is E3. And we want it to play for all notes except if the previous note is D3. If the previous note is D3, we want to play our legato transition. So we're going to make separate lines for all of the possible notes we could be coming from. Now that I've got all my sustain samples in place, I'm going to move that legato sample that transitions into E3 up. I'm doing all this by hand for the purposes of this tutorial, but in a real-world scenario, you should probably use a spreadsheet app to generate all of these combinations. Now we just repeat this process for the next note. In a large legato instrument, you could end up with hundreds or even thousands of lines, and it's very easy to make a mistake if you don't come up with a system of some kind. I'm going to fast forward through this so that you don't have to watch it in real time. Okay, here it is, all done. It looks pretty nice in the text editor. You can tell which ones are the true legato transitions because they have longer lines. And yeah, you can basically see all of the notes, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, etc. Okay, let's listen back to this thing. Okay. From every possible source to every possible destination. Sounds pretty great. So the only remaining problem is that when you do a legato transition and you hold the note, eventually the note dies down. Check it out. The reason for that, of course, is that the second wave file that we're playing is that legato transition, and that legato transition doesn't have any looping in it. The only samples we have that actually contain looping are the sustains. So really what we want is to play the sustain sample. Then when the user presses a second key, we play our legato transition, and then we transition back to the sustain sample for the destination note. In other words, we need to add another group. I'm actually going to just duplicate this group, and I'm going to move it down. And we're going to fill it with the sustain samples from that first group. Before we do that, we're going to actually bump this number, group 3, off by 3, but otherwise it's going to be basically the same as this legato group, but it's going to contain these sustain samples. So this gets us most of the way towards where we want to be. If I play D and then E, while the D key is held down, it's going to play this sustain file, then it's going to play this transition, and then at the same time it's going to play the E. Check it out. Now, as you probably heard, there's a problem there. This E sample is triggering at exactly the same time as this legato transition. What we want is we want the legato transition to play for a little bit, and then we want to trigger that E. So what we need to do is we kind of need to delay group 3 from actually making any sound. So let's go back to sfzformat.com, and you can see at the very bottom there's a section called True Sampled Legato, and that has a bunch of settings that are very useful for exactly this scenario. Specifically, there are ADSR, or I guess ADHSR envelopes and settings that we can basically just grab wholesale from here and use. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually grab this, the hold, decay, and sustain settings. Actually, I'm going to grab all of this. Even the offset would probably work, even though we've been using 43,000. And I'm going to paste them here. And what this is going to do is it's going to put an envelope on group 2 so that it dies down during its decay phase. It's basically going to play the legato transition, but only for a short bit of time. And down here, you can see that there's a whole separate set of sections for the legato sustains. And we're just going to grab those wholesale, and good luck to us. And basically the premise of this is we're going to start our sample like 5,000 samples in, so a little bit in, so we're not getting the very beginning of the note. And we're also going to slowly, not so slowly, but over the course of 300 milliseconds or 0.3 seconds, we're going to slowly ramp up the amplitude. So as this one is ramping down, this one is ramping up, and they should just kind of trade places. So let's hear how it sounds. That sounds pretty decent. Obviously, in a real-world scenario, I'd probably spend like 2 or 3 hours just tweaking these values and just coming up with exactly the right curve and exactly the right attack and decay. But yeah, that's the general idea. That's how you do true legato in SFZ format. Okay, I think that's it. If you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you could hit like, and if you haven't done so already, now is a great time to subscribe. I got a bunch more videos on the way, so yeah, stay tuned.